Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to another of Dialogue with Prof. Mandi Rukuni. Tonight's session focuses on universities and industrialization of the African society. This is a continuation from last week's topic, which is part of the African Development University series. Tonight we have a panel we've invited who will make 10-minute presentations. After that, we'll open up the floor to our audience to be able to ask questions to the panel and to further the discussion. We have invited Dr. Mtetwa. He's a trained Zimbabwean archaeologist with extensive background in prehistory of sub-Saharan Africa. We also have Dr. Munyanyiwa. He's a doctor in management and organizational leadership from the University of Phoenix, USA. He has held many senior positions in the tourism and hospitality industry and has served as Zimbabwe's tourism diplomat to the Republic of China. We also have Dr. Hungwe. He's a Zimbabwean-born soil scientist. He taught soil science at the University of Zimbabwe. Before going into consulting, he established a company called Soils Incorporated back in 1994. He has worked in several African countries. We also have Dr. Muringani. He's a Zimbabwean scholar working in interaction of economic geography, innovation studies, and political science, and is currently based in Norway. He holds and recently defends his PhD in institutions and economic development, focusing on devolution. Welcome to our panel. Tonight's order, Dr. Munyanyiwa will go first, followed by Dr. Mtetwa, Dr. Hungwe, and then Dr. Muringani, before we open up the floor for questions. Thank you. So over to you, Dr. Munyanyiwa.
Okay, good evening. Let me just upload my presentation here. Just hold on, trying to.
Good evening, Doc.
Yes, I do. Yes, I'm trying to upload my my presentation. I'm going to share screen, isn't it? Can you hear me?
You're sounding a bit faint.
Yeah, okay, I'm trying to get into, to upload my presentation. Can you hear me? All right, I'm trying to upload my presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Doc. Let me give you permission. Now you've got permission.
Okay, right, let me just check it out. Where is my files here? No, where is it? Now here. Just 1 minute. Where is it? Okay, got it.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. All right, good evening again. And also thank you very much for to Kevin and Prof for organizing this forum of today. And I think it's a very, very important discussion, given the importance that we give to the role of universities in development and the continuous debate that surrounds what exactly the universities are doing in as far as development is concerned. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me try just a quotation from a quote from Kofi Annan. He says, the university must become a primary tool for Africa's development in the new century. Universities can help develop African expertise. They can enhance the analysis of African problems, strengthen domestic institutions, serve as a model environment for the practice of good governance, conflict resolution, and respect for human rights, and enable African academics to play an active part in the global community of scholars. This is what Kofi Annan had to say about the role of universities. Then I want to take an insight into university, the status quo. Okay, most African nations strove to establish at least one national university immediately after independence. The major purpose was for establishing universities in these countries, and it still is for institutions to play a pioneering role in addressing problems of poverty, social disorganization, low production, unemployment, hunger, illiteracy, disease. That is the problems of underdevelopment, which appear to be common on the African continent. This is what we are seized with, and this is what we expect universities to play a role in making sure that we eradicate some of these problems. But the question is, how far have we been able to, have universities been able to, to impact on the development of, on the eradication of this. To date, we have an estimated 1,650 higher education institutions, and many of them are facing challenges that require intervention of various stakeholders, national governments and development partners, in order for students to maximize their learning outcomes and contribute effectively to the workforce. And I'm highlighting all these issues because they are all linked to the role that universities will play in terms of industrialization. Over the last decade, universities have faced steady criticism for illicit practices such as political bias, hoarding, wealthy endowments, and providing insufficient economic returns for students. And as I unpack some of the issues I had, you'll see what the connection with these slides. Currently, most African countries face shortages of human resources because we are experiencing a lot of a lot of our capable, our educated personnel have all left into the diaspora. And capacity within the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as well as in agriculture and disciplines. And these are key disciplines for development. And you see, I'll flex some statistics to see in terms of numbers of how many graduates are coming out of each discipline and how then we can redevelop if we are coming from those team bases. Scientists are key to industrialization. The current pattern of skills production in Africa does not match labor market demand or development needs. Okay, and as we continue again, higher education in Africa faces severe constraints in terms of attaining critical mass of quality faculty, and we're going to be talking about as I highlight other issues. The average percentage of staff with PhD in a public higher education institution in Africa is estimated at less than 20%. Obviously, my statistics are a bit dated, but I just thought this would give us a little bit of insight into where we are at and where we could be maybe 10 years later. But I don't think we've made a lot of progress. And also, university faculty operate within a system that really asks them to prove their value to the broader public. And this has been a subject of debate in terms of what, all the research that is undertaken, and say the research that universities undertake, they just end up in there on the shelf. And it's like, the perish, publish or perish syndrome that only drives us. Rather, academics are rewarded for developing and testing theories and published findings in books and journals in their field. And obviously, we're then very happy to move around with, highlighting that we've published so many. Then the second part of my presentation, I just want to give us context of the background of where the universities are coming from and where they are. University output versus societal requirements. We'll look at Westernism impact on Africa's development. Graduate distribution analysis, I've got some statistics, a bit dated, but they can give us some insight. Research publications, the patterns, research and million analysis, research funding, panacea, and proposed intervention. And here I just, give an insight into Western culture. Westernism is coined from the word Western, which refers to the act of bringing ideas or ways of life that are typical of Western Europe and North Africa to other countries. And of course, here I want to talk about the issue of culture context, to say then these foreign cultures that are coming into our areas, how then do we how then do you adopt them to our local conditions. And obviously, we have the problem of Western versus local cultures, and there's been conflict over years. And we also talk about acculturalization, which is a process in which members of one cultural group adopt beliefs and behavior of another group. And usually this is the minority adopting the majority way of life. But what has happened over years, it is the majority who have now adopted the minority who come to the continent. And we're talking in all spheres of societal development. Then education was a major tool in the cultural conquest of Africa, and the colonizing powers realized this quite early. Western education had an impact on the African societies during colonial rule and the process of decolonization also in the time after independence. And this has had an impact in the way we do business, the way we are schooled. And I'll discuss a little bit about that. Okay, again, we go back to our history. Western civilization culture began to put in African social cultural meaning. First, with the contact of the Europeans in Africa, the consequence of the Berlin Conference in the request for imperial proliferation of African resources, and later consolidated by the unstoppable wave of globalization. It is important to stress that supported and retarded the pace and tempo of cultural growth and the trend of civilization in Africa. Thus, Africa is a false start in industrialization. So this disturbance, we still have a hangover of this disturbance, and we have to find a way of getting out of this disturbance for us to be able to move forward. Some interesting statistics. Then when we look at the universities at the moment, I wanted now to put into context of the output that we're getting. You can see this. Agriculture. Okay, these are a bit dated, but I want to think that nothing has changed. I got this from the forum. Nothing has changed much. Agriculture, 3% of the graduates are coming from graduating in agriculture. And you are saying, and that I remember, I think a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, when Prof. Rukuni talked about, the role of agriculture in industrialization, and we are saying agriculture is a key driver of industrialization. And if we are only then producing only 3% of our graduates being, agriculturalists, then we've got something happening. Then education, 22%, health, 7%, and we're looking at engineering, sciences, 9%, and we're scoring very high on social sciences and humanities. So in terms of our strategy, if we are going to be able to industrialize, then we should work around moving up these numbers, okay? And you realize, like, even when we talk about the sciences, the sciences, they cost money. So it means the government must put in money into those sciences, because otherwise, if they require more funding than the social sciences, and there has to be a balanced output from the universities if we are to achieve some form of balanced industrialization. Then I'll go to the next one. Let's look at research output analysis. This is a bit dated, but it gives us an idea of what we're talking about. You can see that the East Asia and Pacific, for 25,000 scientific publications, patents 65,000. Europe and Central Asia, you can see the numbers are very high. And as we come further down Africa there, we have sub-Saharan Africa, 3,000 scientific publications and only 101 publications. So it means we really have to look at those areas and say, listen, where do we have to invest as government if our universities are going to be effective, or if our education system is going to be effective? Then I look at researchers per million, right? You can see those numbers, okay? Sub-Saharan Africa, 48 per million. North Africa, 160. Latin America, 261. Brazil, 168. India 158, China 459, United States 4,100. So those are numbers that should guide us in terms of how then do we achieve industrialization based on the output from the universities. How do we influence that output from universities? We really have to maybe relook at the funding, we look at the curriculum that is actually being offered. And I want to think that this is this should be an all-encompassing realignment of the curriculum to be able to achieve those numbers. Then let's look at research funding vernacular. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Right? You can see that with foreign funding, we're not determining the agenda. We have our own agenda, but this is where we are at, but we are not able, versus Zimbabwe, okay, 2.8, I think we know what our situation is. We have not been receiving a lot of funding, but the countries that, like Mozambique and Burkina Faso, just to give a bit of examples, you can see that the greater part of funding is foreign funding, and it comes with its own preconditions. So you cannot develop using that foreign funding. There has to be an internal approach to be able to capacitate the universities for further development. And maybe I'll conclude, given the time constraint, recommended intervention, culturalism to be at the center of development. And we look at people, countries like PRC, Japan, South Korea, to name a few. Culture was at the center of their development. And we need to look at our own concept. We need to look at our own cultural philosophy to be able to move forward. What is it that we need to do as Africa? What are those concepts that we need to adopt? Align policy to actual needs. And the needs you can see from those statistics. If we are going to develop, if agriculture is going to develop, the university or the institutional output must at least be within reasonable levels. We put our money where our mouth is. Promote PP and including funding. You've got to find a way of promoting these PPs and including funding. And we have to really provide that. Nobody's going to provide that. Contextualization of theory, Western versus African. A lot of these concepts, we just taking them wholesome. We really have to adopt them to local conditions, local theories. How do we apply them? How do they become relevant? Institutional leadership, very important. A lot of our institutions are weak in terms of institutional leadership and management, and that needs to be really looked at. Academic mobility, including the African diaspora, we should be able to tap in. Yes, we there's a huge brain drain, but now with technology, we need to find a way of harnessing all the resources that we have within the diaspora. ICT, for teaching, learning, and research, and of course now with COVID, we really have to start really to work hard to catch up, because we really have to adopt ICT. And of course, making available the thesis, scholarly works available to wider audience in and outside Africa. People have to know what we are doing and what the findings are. There's still a lot of positive information from the African continent, and that needs to be highlighted. Graduate fellowships and small grants for PhD support. We really need to invest a lot in our research because in terms of our PhD faculty, we are very low, and also there has to be proper funding of that those PhDs if they are going to be relevant and if they are going to solve real problems. Link universities to productive sectors of the economy, giving support to African higher education institutions to assist their host country achieve sustainable development goes through policy research. So those are some of the recommendations in brief that one would think of in terms of how universities can really contribute. And of course, the most important thing on a concluding position is that we need to understand where we are at and what we need to do. And the facts and statistics speaks for itself. So we need to know what is it that we need to prioritize. And those statistics in agriculture, we are producing 3%, we're producing 7% in sciences and all that stuff. and we really need to develop, and those are the key drivers. I think we need to up those numbers, we need to invest in those numbers, and that's where our policy and strategies should focus on. Given the time, I think that's all I had to say. I'd like to say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some few thoughts. Thank you very much, Kevin, and our audience. Thank you very much. Hello? Hello? I think I'm done.
Hello. Thank you very much, Doc. Thank you very much, Doc, for such an insightful presentation. We now hand over the floor to Dr. Mtetwa. Good evening, Dr. Mtetwa.
Good evening. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to also give a brief talk or a contribution to the theme that we are discussing today. Let me share my screen here. I've got a few slides to help me discuss what I want to talk about here. So, can you see my screen there?
We can, Doc.
Let me put it on slideshow mode. Right, so what I intend to talk about here in line with the various topics or items that were highlighted to us, my mind got attracted to the idea of higher education and our African learners, how our African learners can be relocated with their identity, but also their ancestral roots. And I want to touch on the potential and the significance of our heritage itself, our African heritage. And by heritage here, I'm talking actually of both the social capital that we have as Africans, but also the material record itself, that it's available as a tool for use in this paradigm shift, if I can use that, because I think that's what it calls for. If we are to relocate our African learners with their identity, but also their roots, it's quite a paradigm shift that we are talking about. So, and that picture there is a picture of Great Zimbabwe, the hill complex itself, and I'm using it here as a social artifact to represent our African heritage. It talks volumes about our heritage. So I want to go to the next slide. Let me see. Okay, here we are. So I just want to give a brief background here to the irony that exists in the conventional knowledge production and consumption itself. You know, despite all of Africa today being independent, especially politically, African learning itself, and including research and teaching, neither sets nor directs knowledge agendas. Even in archaeology, this is a point that has been discussed quite significantly within archaeology. We do not set or direct the research agenda itself. So we mostly participate in research programs that are conceived and funded from Europe, and we are just participating like that. So that kind of situation is an irony, because when you look at the African historical and anthropological record itself, in terms of social and material knowledge systems and practices, you would find that Africa is a major source of analogies and philosophies that are shaping global thinking or knowledge production. So you can talk of some concepts that have come out of Africa and are being appreciated or used in the global community. For example, the concept of Ubuntu itself, it has been celebrated around the world, but it comes from Africa. Again, we also know that in Africa, we usually say it takes a village to raise a child. So, there are many other examples that I can talk about, but just these two, they can begin to show us how much as Africa we have in terms of concepts that can potentially travel around the globe, apart from shaping our thinking here in Africa. These concepts can equally shape knowledge production and societies around the globe. And where does this come from? And I think here I'm preaching to the choir, really. This kind of irony originates from centuries ago, especially in the German universities, when Western scholars began to think about African societies as, for example, what David Hume here writes. He says, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures among them, no arts, no sciences. In our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of whom none ever discovered the symptoms of ingenuity, though low people without education will start up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. You can relate with that kind of scorn. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but it is likely he's admired for slender accomplishments. This is how much of the cultural merit of Africans has been scorned at. It's thought about as slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. And Hegel parrots the same words later. He says they have no arts, no sciences. As we see them now, so they have always been. So you can see that this is where the irony comes from. This is where the dilemma that we are comes from. It's centuries of scorn and stereotype regarding lack of innovation, lack of technological ingenuity from Africa. But how then can we come out of this? I am making an argument here that if we can dive into the indigenous social and material knowledge practices that are replete in Africa's historical and anthropological record, including the archaeological record, for me, who is an archaeologist, we have the potential to gestate an alternative way of thinking about agency, of thinking about power, about social production and reproduction of the society itself. So there is a need for new theory making. And where do we get the tools, the apparatus to make those new theories? And that's where I'm saying we need to borrow a lot from our indigenous African philosophies and conceptions that we find in our proverbs, for example, in our idioms, which, are rehearsed every day. When we speak these idioms, we are actually rehearsing the ideals and ideas of our personality as Africans. And in my last slide here, I'm just giving one example. You know, we have got more than 300 such sites in Southern Africa, the bigger percentage, of course, being in Zimbabwe. And it has been very difficult to explain why do we have so many such sites built in dry stone walls. Now, in digging into our proverbs, like I argued in the previous slide, you would find that there are proverbs that have been used as concepts, alternative concepts for thinking about such materials, for thinking about ourselves. For example, a proverb like Ushema Dzoro Hunoravanwa has provided an alternative conception of African leadership, in which these numerous elite settlements of the Zimbabwe type come out as succession politics, which resulted in the creation of numerous elite centers with different occupational durations. And this is in stark contrast to the conventional view of leadership in Africa, where out here in Europe, our leaders in Africa are known to be dictatorial and leadership as lifetime. Once somebody becomes a president, they have to die a president. But when you look into the archaeological record, you can begin to see that actually it is not so. There is sequential power shifts that can be perceived. So my case here, as I close, is us bringing into the learning environment as much of our social and material capital as possible. And this will help in reorienting our African learners to alternative perceptions about our being human and the knowledge that we would want to generate and share with the world around us. Thank you so much, Mr. Kumira, for the opportunity you gave me to just weigh in with these few points.
Thank you very much, Doc. Thank you very much for your presentation. Our next panel member is Dr. Hungwe.
Hello, good evening, everybody, and I feel honored to be here with you and to share a few ideas. And I also would like to thank the two speakers ahead of me for the very interesting discussions that they brought before us. I was asked to talk about African universities and industrialization on the African continent, the same as the other guys. I took a slightly different slant and would like this to be a bit of a fireside discussion. So what I'm going to do is to raise a few flags which are going to guide our discussion and hopefully argument. Because what we're going to do today is not to settle the subject, but to open it for discussion for many years to come. In discussing this very wide subject of African universities and industrialization, I'd like to, first of all, say that in recognizing that it's a very broad subject, I am going to be guided by very simple principles, two of them. One is back to basics. We have been floundering along for a long time, and I think it's time for us now to go back to basics. The second principle is let's keep it simple. It's called the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, where we are basically saying, if we can boil it down to something stupid, then everybody can discuss it. So the starting point for me has been the two sessions that we have had, which were led by Professor Rukuni And for me, one of the major take-home lessons there, not being an economist, has been that you don't develop and become an industrialized nation without going through two preceding stages. So the first stage is mass production, the second stage is mass consumption, and the third stage is then your industrialization, where you are now utilizing your mass production as your raw materials. This, I think, should be our foundation for discussing industrialization. And he then very smartly separated industrialization into three areas, where he said you have proto-industries. These are the first ones, like your rural industries. He persuaded us not to use informal, but let's call them proto. Then you have light industries. Then you have heavy industries. I just want us to recognize at this point that most of the European universities and developed world universities, they are in research is focused mainly on the heavy and light industry because they have evolved, and they do work on proto, but their need is more for the heavy and light industries. But there is a gap on the proto industries. And I'll come back to this point. I just want to step aside a bit and say that we have to recognize the environment that we are operating in. The African environment is 70 to 80%, well, 50 to 75% rural. People are living in rural areas. The urban people tend to be minorities, but otherwise people who have linkages with rural areas account for about 50 to 75%. Then we also have to realize that about 50 to 80% of the employment is in agriculture. So what we now have to realize is that whatever we do in terms of industrialization has to be based on where most of our labor is currently operating. And the third thing I would like us to recognize is let's not lose sight of the way we are doing things. Most of the activities of the rural areas haven't changed for a long time. I've lived in the rural area all my life. The way we've tilled the land hasn't changed much. The plow that we use hasn't changed much in the last 50 years. The way we draw water from the well and carry it home hasn't changed. So I see here an opportunity for us to recognize this as we devise our industrialization. The governments on the African continent unfortunately tend to be more focused because they are directed from Europe, as Dr. Mtetwa and Dr. Munyanyiwa were saying, have been directed or tend to be mimicking the developed countries. There is less focus on our rural areas. Then I leave it at that point, and I just want to pick up one small point, which is that if you notice in the last 25 years, there's been a proliferation of African universities. And a friend of mine and I were laughing the other day that the beauty of this proliferation of African universities has been that it has stopped making an African graduate a protected species, because people used to think that once you had a degree, the world owed you, but now it doesn't. And I believe this is the entry for us into an era where people are now going to have to be useful. The world now doesn't owe them, they owe the world. So if The frontier for us is proto-industrialization, because heavy industry and light industry, the research for it is taken care of by work that is ongoing through our Eurocentric research and university education. The future African university, for me, has to now reorient itself towards proto-industrialization. This will actually be quite a major shift in the way we do business, because all along we have been working on light industry. So a graduate from the university in engineering has been working on heavy machinery. I'll pick up on this again. I'll just proceed to say it is beyond the scope of my discussion here to list everything that can be done in industrialization. I mean, the list is endless. However, let me just give you a few examples which follow my principles of back to basics and keeping it simple. If we are going to make an impact, we need to attend to the things that we do day to day. Our universities have to, the research has to be directed at the things that we do day to day. In agriculture, we have to devise a new way of tilling the land. It's up to our researchers to do it. I have not seen anybody who has been awarded a Nobel Prize or a heavy duty prize for designing a donkey or ox-drawn cart, but people are working on hydrocarbon engines. Isn't it time that our African researchers started looking at efficient ways of using donkey and cattle-drawn carts in Africa and donkey and cattle-drawn implement? We cook using firewood, and we have got very poor supply of lighting in rural areas. What research are we doing? Because all these researches will lead directly into industrialization. If you go to high density residential areas in Africa, go to any city, there's a problem of garbage. What research are we doing to manage the collection of garbage in our countries? Now, these examples that I've given you are just a few, and they relate to hard sciences. How about the soft sciences? Industrialization depends on strong institutions, and the institutions are developed through good research in social sciences. So how can we design institutions that propel our industrialization? For example, in my rural area, each time a chief dies, there is big fights and big arguments about how to choose the next chief. And I've always said to myself, surely by now we should know. I mean, there's never any argument about the replacement of the Queen of England. It's known, the genealogy is written. So I see our African universities being very useful, documenting genealogies of our chieftains. And then we would spend more time working on how to develop our communities instead of fighting about who is going to be the next chief. I can go on and on and on, but these are just a few of the ideas that I have and that I'm presenting before you for discussion on how our universities can actually reorient themselves to be appropriate and attuned to the needs of the country. However, it wouldn't be proper for me to finish without throwing in two punches that I really would like to raise before I close. One is that everything that we propose has to be aligned to our reward system. If we really want our African researchers to work on African issues, our reward system has to also be aligned to those priority areas. So Will a professor who is working on donkey-drawn carts be rewarded the same as one who is working on nanotechnology? I throw the question to you. And lastly, I will say tongue-in-cheek, when a friend of mine and I were discussing once about how we can get rural areas in Africa to develop, I mentioned tongue-in-cheek, I said, you know what, if I was an African president, I'll just say upon graduation with your PhD, I would say, I don't want to see all those PhD in urban areas. Go back to your villages and sort the problems out in those areas. If they spend 2 weeks without lighting, they will come up with an invention to sort it out. If they have to walk 12 kilometers to the nearest clinic, they would surely design a more appropriate health system. With that, I say thank you very much, and I hope we can find a solution to our industrialization needs in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hungwe, for that presentation. What a closing. I bring to you next Dr. Muringani. Dr. Muringani.
Thank you, Kelvin. Thank you, the audience. Am I clear? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are, sir.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to join the esteemed panel and also to leverage on the work of Professor Rukuni. I think Africa and industrialization is a topic that is critical not only today, but also in the future. As we followed Professor Rukuni's presentations in the past two series, we see that he lays the groundwork and the tools for engagement on this important discussion. So one of the things I'll highlight and latch on is the fact that he first tells us that we have to know who we are as Africans. So in other words, we have to discover ourselves. So if we discover ourselves, then we realize what we have that we can use to become what you want to become. So you discover yourself, then use something to become what you want to become. So I see this as a process of rediscovery of Africa. And it calls for a new way of thinking that he calls generative thinking, where there's no end or there's a start, but the idea is to remain open-minded. And according to him, this is what will put Africa on the pedestal of development. More for Africans, and of course, for the benefit of others. So I also want to thank the panelists for laying the groundwork. In particular, Dr. Munyanyiwa talked about knowledge as the critical tool for economic competitiveness. That is, if we are to compete globally, we must have the knowledge. And Dr. Mtetwa also emphasized that for us to have this knowledge, we cannot forget our past, which is what Professor Rukuni is always emphasizing, that our culture is the source of what we do, is the source of confidence. So based on that confidence, we can reinvent the future. And Dr. Hungwe brings us now to the concept of the university and industrialization and say, there is a gap between what we are doing and what we should do. There is a gap between what we see and what we want to see. And indeed, the university is at the center of some of these gaps. So I'll bring now the university and try to see what gaps exist in this sense. So the first thing that is clear, as Professor Rukuni emphasized in the past, was that there was excitement at one time about independence. So called that the euphoria of independence, which then moved us to a sense of doing things. You know, with Julius Nyerere making a very positive comment about education and the role of the university and many others. Then there was a time when then there was some disillusionment because those promises were not met. So there was some disillusionment about the role of the university in society. And this disillusionment even came from the government, which was the sponsor of the university. So the government begin to see the universities as opposition, as people that they must work against or not with each other. So we start to see certain funding for the university being channeled through the president's offices in other countries or other various agencies. And the universities start bleeding, so they don't have resources. But we are hopeful that now there's a form of re-engagement where the role of the university is now being debated again in this regard, looking at Africa's industrialization. But still, there's disillusionment. So it is clear that there's an expectation that the university must do something, but unfortunately, universities do not work miracles. They're not miracle workers. Universities exist within the society, which means as the society changes, the university also changes. So in this case, we can argue that there is a sense of co-evolution, changing together of the university system and the society system and other systems. So what becomes critical, as Professor Rukuni says, is that we need to understand that we're talking about systems. As Dr. Hungwe emphasized, that we need to look at mass production and mass consumption. So if we can link the two and create backward and forward linkages, then the university can create a critical role in facilitating that going forth and going backward. But unfortunately, as I've said, universities do not work miracles, but they exist within the society. So that brings us back to the issue of knowledge. So what do we mean about knowledge being central to economic development? So knowledge is embedded in the society. And as Dr. Hungwe points it, that a conversation around knowledge systems, around institutions, around rules and norms that guide the production of knowledge, but also encourage its consumption are critical, because you cannot have a university and have a society failing to elect a chief when that knowledge can be warehoused, can be archived, and can be utilized when needed. So that education becomes knowledge at the point of action. So we see this fragmentation between the university, between the society, and at times the state. So these gaps then create confusion, and unfortunately at times these gaps also create confusion where one part wants to do what the other part is doing, or the opposite. So we have seen that, for instance, looking at Zimbabwe, the University of Zimbabwe since 1980 was very popular. But I'll be honest, it was not popular for what it must do. It was popular for things like strikes, things like confronting government, which is a necessary evil, which is a necessary thing to do. But I think universities should also be popular for what they're supposed to be doing. So we would then expect our gifted sons and daughters to come with new ideas that will revolutionize society. But that is not only the problem of the University of Zimbabwe. I think that problem lies across Africa, which shows that even the state, with its expectation, is also failing to meet its needs for the democratization of society. So people expect that the state will do certain things, the university expect that the state will do certain things, and the state expect that the university will also do certain things. So there's this crisis of expectations between the three. But we know that now there's some re-engagement, so we are beginning to date each other again, to find each other again, to say, where is the university, where is the state, where is the society, and what can bring us together? I think starting there could be a good starting point. Ask ourselves, where is the university? Where is the society? Where is the state? What role should each play? And how can we move together? So realizing our strength and less of our weaknesses, because quite often we spend more time blaming each other and not moving forward. But I think to move forward, to re-engage the university in Africa's industrialization, we need to forgive each other and start from somewhere and say, look, we are not perfect, but we can start somewhere so we can learn by doing. So one thing we need to understand is that there is no place for miracles in academia. If there are, thank God. But the idea is that let us forgive each other and honestly make honest mistakes. So let's fail forward. Let's learn by doing and build precept upon precept. As Dr. Hungwe said, we can start with the proto-industry. Let's see how we can change agriculture for the better. Let's see how we can change medicine for the better. Let's see. So we start there, then started building our knowledge system and start refining them. We have seen some promising efforts in India and other parts of the world, like in Asia and Latin America, where in India, we know the issue of telemedicine, and eventually the Indians started leading that perspective and they started repackaging the ideas to sell to the West. We also see the same in Brazil, where the Brazilians have done very well in the ethanol production systems, or the Cubans in health, and their knowledge has been packaged and now it's being commercialized globally. So there's always a starting point where as Africans, we can always find our niche, but we can only find our niche if we come together with a common purpose and knowing that we are not yet there, but we are willing to learn. So if we learn by doing, we can build our capabilities over time. But quite often, the challenge is that we want to start from the top. So it's like grave digging. Everybody wants to start from the top. But I think it's time that we start from the bottom. And starting from the bottom means being humble enough, means that the university is embedded in the society, is embedded in the communities. It talks to the communities, understands their needs, and make the communities part of the expanded system of learning. So learning does not only happen in buildings, but happens where the people are. If we do that, we find that some of the ideas that we are failing to realize, but which foreigners are taking advantage of and later on commercialize, can be done by our own people, our own systems, in our own economies. A good example that we have is Lyft. You know, Lyft is the ride-sharing company which is in the United States. We know that some students who were doing anthropology came to Zimbabwe and studied the way of living of Africans. How do we do our transport system, our mobility in the urban areas? And they realized that there's already a latent business model. There's something lying in Africa that people are not utilizing globally. And they're able to start their company ZimRide. They tested the concept, they packaged the concept, and they scaled it up globally. And now it's a global company in the US. So it's an idea that was seen to work in Zimbabwe, but now it works globally. So which means our university, there's a lot, even in our heritage system, like as Dr. Hungwe was saying, Dr. Mtetwa was saying, that we can look into and see what can we make of it. So the university cannot be alone, neither is the society nor the state. But we need this discourse to come together and start thinking, what is it that we can do, each part doing its own part, and how can we work together to make the university the center of industrialization and to make industrialization happen in society, where society, state, and the university are working together in a process of mutual dependence, not a process of dominance. So can we allow the university to be autonomous, to have its own authority to do certain things, and the state has the capacity and its authority to do what it wants to do, and also expect the society to have clear demands on the university and the state to say this is what we want to be. So I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we can do as society, as state, as universities, and how can we work together? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muringani, for that presentation. Thank you to the panelists for an all insightful presentations which have been made by everybody. I now open up the floor for questions and contributions. Please use the hand reaction emoji to anyone who wishes to ask any one of the panelists or anyone a question or a contribution, and we'll unmute you. Joshua?
Mr. Moderator, I'd like to, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Let's start. Just like to thank my colleagues here, Dr. Munyanyiwa and Mtetwa, Hungwe, and Muringani, for a very insightful discourse. Just picking up on the cultural thing, I'd like to say, like people were saying in Shona, so kutigirira, ukwengezelela, what people were saying. From our observations in interacting with both academia and the real world, I kind of felt like a lot of us talk about it, but sometimes we don't seem to apply ourselves to actually doing what we're talking about. As Dr. Mtetwa talks about understanding the cultural environment, I'm saying to myself, how many of us right now would say they've gotten a good idea about the meanings of current Shona sculpture? You walk in Edinburgh Festival and you find stuff by M Kumira and the like, and you ask anybody in the street, academia or otherwise, in Harare, in Bulawayo, in Maswingo, do they know all these great artists? That also calls us to really should be talking the talk. And then when you look at our curricula and how, as Dr. Hungwe sort of points out, that sometimes it's not grounded in the basics. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to talk to some master's students at USEC in the Agricultural Economics faculty. We were just about to choose their topics for research. And you suddenly found that, and I exposed them to say, can you tell me what's happening in the village? What sort of critical issues are going on food security, on food growing, and food processing? And a lot of them couldn't seemingly put them to the ground. It's just like, okay, currently you're talking about the marriage between understanding what's going on in the village and what's going on globally, because we all talk about the global village. And you have all these people who are going to what are called COP conferences, community of parties, to talk about environmental issues. And you say, how do you relate that to your grandma in the village? Do you understand what the carbon footprint really is in that village that you come from? And you suddenly find that these concepts, that there's a heck of a disconnect. And the academia is also not assisting in grounding our students in these practical realities. So there's really need for us to revisit our curricula. I mean, when we talk about supporting the proto type industry, one sort of thinks, okay, Institute of the Higher Institute for Technology, Harare, the HIT, doing some good strides in trying to incorporate the research into technology. But one also says, how many of us really take into consideration what's going on down the road in Barra, to say, how do you raise that thing into a type of product that can be manufactured in the village or in the township and later on be mass produced? Those are some of the practical realities that we also need to revisit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for that. A gift.
Thank you very much. I agree with the panel presenters, although I have just few comments to add to that. I was looking at the presentation by Dr. Mtetwa.
Gift. Sorry, gift.
We can't hear anything. Somebody needs to just intervene and get us to move.
Your connection
Simon,
bad.
I've sent a gifted message. Simon.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hello. Thank you.
Hello.
Quite interesting discussions. My questions are mainly two. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
The first The question I wanted to ask was, yes, I wanted to ask whether we need to start from scratch or we need to build on what already exists of development and technology as a way forward for industrialization for Africa. Asking this, why? Because it is better to look at what exists and use what exists to build what doesn't exist. For example, if we look at the model that countries like China have taken, it was a question of learning what is happening in the developed world, and then finding out how to engineer technologies and then reproduce more, maybe reduce costs, and also making sure that then produce. And is mass consumption really the key driver for effective and sustainable industrialization, given that we produce for the globe, the world? I know some people before you produce for yourself, but I think it's possible to mass produce for the world, even if you are not the main consumer of what you are producing. I think, I don't know, I'm asking the panel so that they can also that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'll hand over to the panel so that the panel can respond to the questions which were asked before we bring another round of questions. So over to you, panelists. Dr. Hungwe.
Okay, I will answer. I will try to answer the last, Mr. Bere, the last question. The short answer to your first question of whether we build from scratch or we start from what's already there is that it always is unwise to reinvent the wheel. So whatever is there, you build on it and you start from scratch. Obviously, the research recognition will be stronger for those things that you do when you work from scratch. And maybe you give your brighter students the assignments that where you're working from scratch, and then the others you can give the development. But it was well explained by Prof. Rukuni in his presentations. Similarly, the second question on mass production versus in consumption. I'm not an economist, but I was quite persuaded by the argument that if you produce for export and emphasize on that, you then fall into the trap of having to have foreign currency and so forth. Whereas if your strength is founded on local production, local consumption, you don't have to deal with foreign currency. You then are only dealing with technology. So, but this is something where I am out of my depth and my colleagues could help. And maybe Prof. Rukuni can come in and take it further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hungwe, for that response. Dr. Muringani.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Engineer Berry, for interesting questions. So the first question, do we start from scratch? So as a social scientist, I mean, like another scientist, I know that in science, we build on the shoulders of giants. So in other words, we come with the new knowledge, but we leverage on old or existing knowledge. So I don't see how that process would be foreign to that concept anyway. But also even in innovation, if we follow Schumpeter, who is regarded to be one of the seminal theories on innovation theory, he said that innovation is the combination of new knowledge and existing knowledge to create new knowledge. So in other words, we cannot do away with what exists, but we would rather try to improve and add on it. Then the second question, you asked whether we must, about mass production. So my understanding is that Professor Rukuni was saying mass production is about us mass producing our own goods and also consuming the same goods. So when you do that, when you produce and you consume, it means you are driving development internally, what economists have called endogenous development. So in other words, you don't expect external forces to play a very active role in your own development. Rather, they come to complement. So if you look at China, it's a good example of mass production. Because China is $1 billion market on its own. But what we see globally is scaling from the local to the global. But the mass production is happening at every scale. So we could start in Bikita and mass produce and mass consume in Bikita and extend that to Masvingo and extend that to Zimbabwe and extend that to Africa. And I think that applies everywhere. So that would be my understanding of mass production and mass consumption with the backward and forward linkages where there's logistics, there are support systems and many other things happening. So that way you find that one form of development ignites another form of development, one form of industry ignites another form of industry, some kind of spillover benefits. And they do, so once you study that cycle, it becomes virtuous. So one form of development leads to another and to another and to another. And what happens is that even you look at a place like Bikita or a place like Gauteng or a place like Accra in Ghana. So over time, places become different in the sense that the dynamics in each of the places will be different. So they are likely to end up at various points, or what economists have called multiple equilibria, at various points of development, even if they start at the same point. But the process should start somewhere at the local level, and then it drives development over time. That is my understanding.
Thank you very much, Doc. Dr. Mtetwa.
Thank you so much for all the contributions that are coming through. With regards to Mr. Berry's questions, I think I would take the first part of, or the first question amongst the several that he raised on whether we are supposed to start anew. I think that's a very interesting question. And what I would say would sound rather extreme, but again, we need to understand, even from the Bible, Jesus was talking about putting new wine in old wineskins. And he was saying it doesn't work. And neither do you put a new cloth on an old cloth as a patch. It doesn't work. So it depends on where we want to go and how far we want to go and with what kind of speed. So I would speak probably with the new universities that are coming up in Zimbabwe, because we still have new universities that are coming up. And I happen to sit in one of the groups that are working with a new university coming up in Chipinge, the Gazaland University, but also there is the Manicaland State University that's coming up. So as long as we are going to have new universities coming up in Zimbabwe, we really need to start anew, especially with those ones. We need this new kind of thinking to shape the whole philosophy of those new universities. Otherwise, they will end up where the other older universities are. So yes, it's possible to start anew, especially looking at the new universities that are coming up, but also even in the old universities, there are new programs that are coming up. What is shaping the philosophies behind those new programs, those new subjects? Or probably the reason why we don't see new subjects is because we are following the old trajectory that we took off from. Professor Rukuni gave us a very good kind of understanding of the fact that, you know, when we look at the Western civilization, it is just one out of a million options. So I think it's the same thing with our universities. The model that we are following right now is just one out of a million. And if we continue to do the same thing over and over and over, expecting different results, you know, one day we'll just come back to the same thing to say, but where are we going? So we feel like we have gone too far, and probably it's time consuming going retracing our footsteps, but probably we haven't gone too far enough for us not to restart what we can restart. So I think I wanted to sound like a bad cop there.
Thank you very much, Doc.
We've got Dr. Taka.
Yes, thank you very much, my colleagues, for all the comments. I'll just maybe make some brief additions to what you have said. In terms of, you know, the question on where do we start from, I think we can leverage on what we have. I think it's the lessons that we have learned from the past that are important. We need to be a good student of learning, and then we can improve on the old processes. We know where the problems are, and if you can reflect on some of, especially on the knowledge side, if you reflect on some of the statistics that I presented here, where we're saying that agriculture is one of the key drivers of industrialization. And I can also refer back to Professor Mandi's earlier presentation on the importance of agriculture. And if we are not investing in it, and we're not only starting from the universities, I think it's a whole curriculum reform that needs to be taken into consideration. We look at the new curriculum in the primary schools. Still, agriculture is one of the subjects, but it's not an important subject. It's one of the subjects, but not important subject, because we're still counting your maths, English, and I think maths and English as the most important subject. So that goes contrary to what we are trying to achieve as a country. So we really have to look at those, the curriculum, and also look at the universities themselves. There are some that have remained in their traditional ways of doing things. And I can reflect on the e-learning stuff. We should have done that years back, but we're caught flat-footed because we're failing to change as a country. And now we don't have a lot of time to do the transformation, and we are running far behind. So I think let's build on what we can. And as I think my other colleague talked about, with the new universities, there is an opportunity to have a clear mandate, because I think there's an issue of where universities have been given mandates, but they are doing they're doing other things in order to survive financially. They are running programs that they are not supposed to be running. That way, they are moving away from what they are supposed to be doing. So that mandate should be matched with the resources and the supervision that it requires, and with very clear targets. We look at maybe Bindura. Bindura is basically supposed to focus on sciences. It must produce more scientists than business people. But I think the statistics are otherwise saying something different. So the mandate for those new institutions must be adhered to and very clear. And lastly, on the mass production stuff, I think I was lucky to have spent at least 10 years in China, and I saw how they do the production. There's an area specialization strategy that they use. If you are producing furniture, it's one province that produces furniture. But with us here, we will try to produce small bits and pieces of everything in every province. And that strategy must change, where we say, if we are going to do aquaculture, it must be in one area, then we can achieve the economies of scale. Because as far as we are producing all over the place and we're trying to do everything, we'll not be able to achieve better economies of scale. And we cannot do everything. I'll give an example. You'd buy a shirt in the market in China for $1. And that is retail to in the market, and that means everybody has put their 10, 20 cents on that shirt. So you can imagine how much that shirt costs. So we need to look at areas where we have competitive advantages as a country, and where we can mass produce. And I know the tobacco is one area where obviously we've had a lot of where we've got advantages, because that tobacco leaf is Zimbabwean and only competing with Brazil. So those are areas that we can look at, and we are achieving those numbers. So I think those are the two comments I wanted to make, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to read Gift's contribution. His network was a bit stable. He was saying cultural values to be in line with resources. African countries are rich in minerals. It's critical to consider mining university so that the next generation can benefit. His second point was to productive research, i.e. countries like Zimbabwe are importing soil in form of high quality bricks, mainly for upmarket structures. There are some of the research areas to be considered. There is need to promote funding for youth or academic research. That's Gift's contribution. So we'll take one round of questions so that the panel can respond, and then we'll close off the session. So anyone with a question or contribution, please use your hand reaction emoji. Any questions or contributions? It seems that there are no questions or contributions. So I'll give I don't know if the panel wants to just share the last 2 minutes just to close off the session before I close off the last remarks. Dr. Muringani.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to leverage on the point raised by Dr. Munyanyiwa on the fact that in Zimbabwe, we are doing everything everywhere, and as a result, we end up lacking economies of scale compared to what is seen in China. And I think that's a very important point, because proto-industrialization, proto-industries doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is doing everything everywhere. So a good example is what Mr. Nkosazana, a journalist, once shared about the tobacco industry in prehistoric times in Gokwe. So they started making tobacco very early, and they were able to sell to the rest of the country. And we don't hear of similar comparative or constructed advantages in other parts of the country. So it's important that we realize how to strategically place our strength. And also, as Dr. Mtetwa said, that these universities can do new things, but if they're going to be doing everything that everyone is doing everywhere, then surely we'll continue on the same trajectory. So from what Dr. Mtetwa put on the ground is what maybe other people who are like Shumbeta would call creative distraction. So we need entrepreneurs who come with new ideas that will transform society forever. So they'll come with new ideas that have not been done before. So, and previously, Professor Rukuni shared about thinkers, thinker doers, about artists. dreamers, people who dream things. So if they say today we think they are mad, but tomorrow realize they're correct. So I think we need to move. We need to move in all angles, not necessarily one-sided, but obviously knowing what to keep from the past because we cannot lose it, but also knowing what to challenge in the future because we need that challenge as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mtetwa.
Thank you so much for the last minute to say something. I wanted to just emphasize the idea that probably what we are going through or what we should be going through, instead of being, a transition, it is actually, and it should be, a metamorphosis itself, especially in the sense of what happens to a caterpillar. By the time it becomes a butterfly, sometimes you don't see any similarities between the two, but it was the same thing that went into that ugly cocoon and then came out as a beautiful butterfly. So personally, I'm looking and really praying for a situation where whatever we do as Zimbabweans and all the daring that it takes to do that. So it shouldn't be superficial because we don't gain any mileage from that. It should be something that really metamorphosizes the whole of our being, and the outcome of that is something that is very different from what we are or what we were before the metamorphosis. So I just wanted to introduce those two concepts of a transition and a metamorphosis as very different processes. And I think what Professor Mandi here is driving us towards is exactly a metamorphosis process, because it takes us back to basics. And from there, we cannot be the same again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Doc. Dr. Hungwe?
I have nothing much to add, and those who have watched movies have heard people say nothing further, Your Honor, except to say thank you very much to everybody who took time to listen. And I sincerely hope that we can continue to exchange and argue and fight, have intellectual fights about this, because out of that is the only way we can hopefully find our way out of this forest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hungwe. Dr. Muringani? Is that your hand up?
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you. I think, thank you very much. I'm done. Thank you to all the panelists and the viewers and everyone else.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Please do like our YouTube channel, Dialogue with Prof. Mandi Rukuni. Do subscribe to get future content, and do like our Facebook page, Dialogue with Prof. Mandi. I would like to thank the panelists for coming through and taking time off their busy schedules and sharing these insightful contributions. Thank you once again to the DWP technical team for putting this session together. And thank you to Prof. Mandi Rukuni for setting up this platform. Join us next week as we continue our discussion. Good night and have a blessed week. Thank you.